Welcome to Stageworthy. I'm Phil Rickaby, the host of this podcast. This is episode 317. If you like this podcast, please consider supporting it. There are a few ways that you can do that. First, you can rate the show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And if you listen on Apple Podcasts, you can also leave a review. If you want to keep up with what's going on with Stageworthy and my other projects, you can subscribe to my newsletter by going to philrickaby.com/subscribe. If you want to leave a tip for the show, you can drop some change in the virtual tip jar. You will find a link for that in the show notes. I also have a Patreon in support of the show. Now, Stageworthy is a one-person operation, and that one person is me. So not only do I arrange the guests, I edit the show, I promote it, and I even created the music. I also shoulder all of the financial responsibilities that keep the show going. So your support means the world. For a subscription of $5, I will take you behind the scenes on the podcast. I'll do regular Q&A sessions, and I'll even present regular, exclusive, interactive conversations just for subscribers. You can find the Patreon at patreon.com/stageworthypod. But one of the most important things you can do, even more than rating it or reviewing it or even supporting it financially, is to share it on social media. Even a simple retweet helps. You can find Stageworthy on Twitter and Instagram at StageworthyPod, and you can find the website with the archive of all 317 episodes at StageworthyPodcast.com. If you want to find me, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Phil Rickaby, and as I mentioned, my website is philrickaby.com. This week, my guest is Artistic Director of the Canadian Stage, Brendan Healy. Brendan is an actor, a director, and an educator. In addition to leadership at the Canadian Stage, Brendan is a former artistic director at Buddies and Bad Times and has been a contributor to the Canadian Theatre Review. During the pandemic, Brendan at Canadian Stage explored new ways of presenting theatrical works, bringing new ways of creating theatre and new methods of presenting it into the digital sphere. Here's our conversation. Are you working from home, or are you in the Canadian Stage offices, or?
Yeah, I'm actually in rehearsals, so I'm at Canadian Stage right now.
Ah, yeah. What's that like these days?
Being back in rehearsal?
Yeah.
Amazing. It's great. Yeah, it's a very, very nice feeling. I had been in rehearsals in sort of over the holidays. We're getting ready to do a show, and then we had to stop rehearsals with Omicron, and that was devastating. But this time I feel like I'm directing a show that will actually make it to the stage. So it's awesome.
That is a good feeling. I mean, I feel like at this point, every time there's like that statement of, "Oh, we can perform again," everybody goes, "Great," but they kind of hold their breath.
Yeah.
Yeah. What has aside from being devastating and difficult, what's the 2 years of the pandemic been like for you and for Canadian Stage?
It's been I think a time of transformation, in a bunch of ways. Like the way that I've been describing the pandemic, it's been like, when you're driving a car and then you hit the brakes and everything that was in the back seat comes sort of flying into the front. And that's sort of what I felt we've gone through as a society. Like we've kind of like, there was like this kind of screeching halt, and then all this stuff that we'd sort of been carrying around with us, but hadn't necessarily been looking at, suddenly became really visible. And we had time and space to really look at that stuff and maybe act on it. So in that way, I think the past 2 years has actually been really positive. We've been able to really ask big questions about what our role is as an arts institution, and lean into some really important areas that we just wouldn't have had a chance to kind of focus on had we not had that opportunity.
Yeah. I mean, those big questions are things that they would come up all the time. Things like the question of are we putting enough people of color on the stages? Are we engaging enough people behind the scenes of color? And all kinds of other questions are the kinds of things that because of the treadmill of production, were difficult things to contend with. And then when things stop, suddenly, though there was not that, if for want of a better word, excuse not to deal with those things, and now we have to deal with them. And I think that's been really positive, I think, for the theater industry as a whole.
Absolutely, and certainly there was a lot of events in the world that also brought those particular questions to the forefront. Absolutely, that sort of necessitated some deep examination. Also, on top of it, there's we often define ourselves by what we do. And I think as people, we do that, and also as institutions. But then when suddenly we weren't able to really do what we typically did, we were left with the thought of like, well, how do I define myself by just being? And that's kind of a bit of an existential question. And so I think artists and organizations kind of had to deal with like, okay, well, if I'm not defined by producing, then what am I? And I think at Canadian Stage, we, really had a chance to kind of lean into our institutional values. So like, what do we believe in? And then try to kind of figure out a way to kind of navigate the past 2 years with our values really guiding us, as opposed to all the other, prerogatives that come into play when you're busy doing things, doing shows.
What were those big questions then, and where did you come out on those when you finally put your values together?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot that I could say about that. I'd say like one of the big things was, who do we exist for? And certainly we have so many stakeholders, and we have a big family at Canadian Stage, and audiences, and I mean there's just so much there. But fundamentally, we serve artists. We create a platform for artists to create, to speak from. And so, the big question is like, well, how do we continue to do that if we can't have audiences in a space? And so a lot of stuff came out of that question. We had a huge microgrant program where we, funded artists to go back to school, we funded projects that enabled artists to really pivot their artistic practice. So to embrace digital technologies, to really re-examine their artistic practice. And that was a huge initiative that we were able to support a lot of artists, but also we were able to, as an organization, really delve into all kinds of new opportunities for how artists can express themselves and perform. We embraced all kinds of new technologies. We did a whole residency in virtual reality, which was, kind of mind-blowing. So out of the question of like, how can we best serve artists, like all kinds of new creative avenues opened up for us as an institution that will carry forward into the future.
In terms of, aside from the virtual reality stuff, which is always fascinating, and how that has developed over the years. I can remember many years ago in I think it was the late 90s, going to the exhibition, and there was a really terrible demonstration that I had to pay for. And I think I paid like $10 to see a bunch of lines surrounding me. And it's, the VR has come such a long way. So that's exploring that in a theatrical experience must have been incredible. But also, did you guys do much with like Zoom and other digital productions as well?
Yeah, we did a lot of stuff over Zoom, not just Zoom, on different online platforms. All of which were really kind of interesting, and what VR offers, apart from the immersive experience, is just kind of a live connection in a digital space, which Zoom can also provide. So all that was really interesting. Like, what is liveness when you're not in a room together? Can you create the feeling of liveness? Can you create intimacy? What is exchange between two bodies that are not sharing a space? It's all super interesting and really fruitful and filled with failure, like a lot of failure, which is, it's a part of the artist's way is to fail. But I'm sort of excited to see, 5 years from now, what has carried forward from this time. I think artists have been working in such different ways, and we can't really predict, what will stick. But it's inevitable that we'll look back and go like, wow, like we learned a lot, or wow, like that really did have an impact on our art form. I don't know if we can totally see what that is specifically just yet.
I don't think we'll know. Obviously we won't know because we can make all kinds of predictions that will not come true.
Yeah,
but
definitely.
I find it fascinating, and I've said this before, how many people were delving into technologies that 2.5 years ago they would have said, "Oh, I could never do that. I'm not technical enough. I could never do that." Mm-hmm. And through all of this, they've explored other ways and made some really interesting. And everybody's got to try and fail before they find out what works, as you said. I'm sort of interested to see if we're able to do and to continue utilizing digital delivery in the future as a way of sort of expanding the audience, serving underserved and accessibility issues, just to see if that's something that we can carry forward, even though logistically it sometimes feels like it's difficult.
Absolutely. The digital disruption creates all kinds of accessibility opportunities. That's for sure. Among the tricky parts of digitization, particularly around distribution, is how to monetize it. And every sector is facing that problem or that question. And the theater is certainly no different. It's what is a financial model that works for online platforms when it comes to performance, and that's a whole other question.
Because those are. Obviously we need to be able to monetize. I think there was early in the pandemic. I think it felt necessary at the time, but it did set somewhat of a unfortunate precedent. Is lots of people giving away their digital production, which felt at the beginning really necessary, but then made it a little harder later on to ask people to pay for those things, because this used to be free and now you're asking me to pay for it. And it's one of those, sort of carries forward, and, trying to figure out like what is a fair, accessible price or a fair price for digital production and digital delivery, while also being able to welcome the audience into this space. I think we're going to have to see how that pans out over time.
Yeah. Digital technology presents all kinds of problems to capitalism, and I think we're still trying to figure that one out as a society. What is the relationship between these things? The other thing I was thinking, Phil, as you were saying, is you sort of mentioned that a lot of artists sort of felt that they could not sort of embrace digital technologies prior to the pandemic. I also feel that there were a lot of us, me included, who felt that like we will not embrace digital technologies. I think for myself, feeling like, no, I'm a theater artist, and this is the interaction that I can work with, which is live in person in a room. And that's what I do. And so the pandemic, I know I was forced to kind of really challenge my assumptions around what I did, and what I, sort of kind of maybe thought was a bit more superior to other forms of connection. It was interesting. Like I kind of had to really reevaluate sort of the fundamentals of what I believe I do as a theater artist. In a healthy way.
Yeah, I don't think you're the only one. I know, there's people who are still even now resistant to digital delivery and digital theater. And there are some people that just want to put that thing back in the box. Like we used it, we had to use it. Let's get rid of it as quickly as possible. And I think because, they'll say things like, well, if it's online, it's not theater. If it's filmed, it's not theater. And I think I've been thinking about this quite a bit because I feel like I'm often defending digital theater with people and sort of sometimes evangelizing a little bit too much. But I feel like it's so necessary that we consider theater to be what we make it to be, rather than tying ourselves to it being one thing. And it will still be that one thing, because online and filmed production and digital production is never going to be exactly that, because that experience of being in the theater is unique and will always be its thing. That experience can never be fully recreated in a digital experience, but people can get a taste of it, which in some cases might encourage them to actually come to the actual theater.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Or the quality of experience online is just different. It's just a different kind of quality of togetherness. Mm-hmm. Anyways, yeah, we could go on and on forever. Right? It's been an interesting couple of years, Phil.
Yes, it has. I think one of the things that I'm curious about is as the artistic director of Canadian Stage, can you tell me a little bit about what was your impression of, and what did you think of the Canadian Stage before you became the artistic director?
It depends at what point in its history, because Canadian Stage has had so many kind of incarnations. My first kind of real contact with Canadian Stage was right after I graduated from theater school. I was part of the first ever sort of RBC Emerging Artist program. It was called BASHT back then. And that's my first introduction to Canadian Stage was that. And through that program, I ended up actually assistant directing Hair. There was a production of Hair that was done by Canadian Stage many years ago. So that was like one version of Canadian Stage. And so the impression that I had there was like a kind of a not-for-profit company that was sort of operating a bit commercially. And sort of was really big and had big ambitious ideas for kind of big commercial productions. And then with Matthew Jocelyn, who's the artistic director right before me, really brought the company in a very different direction. I think sort of embraced like more less commercially driven work, much more artistically innovative and work, and really kind of brought on this mandate that became very international, very multidisciplinary. There's some theater, but also dance and other forms. So it's a very different company. What drew me to the company was sort of the artistic vision that Matthew kind of initiated, was one that I was really excited by, and felt really like I really wanted to kind of pick up the mantle from that artistic vision and kind of move it forward in sort of my own way. So it's a very long answer to your question, which was basically I was really inspired by the work that Canadian Stage was doing, and was really eager to kind of be a part of that conversation.
And what does, as the artistic director, how do you see yourself moving what came before forward, and how are you putting your own spin on it, and how are you what do you see, where do you see it going in your tenure?
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting because I haven't really experienced the company outside of COVID. So much of my experience of the company has been sort of, responding to the pandemic. What I can say is that sort of the impulse for me was like, how can the mandate at Canadian Stage really feel like an authentic reflection of Toronto? And how can its kind of contemporary aspirations and sort of innovative inspirations, just really represent the people and the ideas and the questions and the realities of everyday Torontonians. So that was sort of that for me is the project. And there's all kinds of ways to kind of look at that question. But that was really that's what I'm interested in.
Yeah. Canadians, I remember the first show that I saw at Canadian Stage many years ago. It was an immersive production called Donut City.
Oh, I don't know that show.
Somehow I don't know if because I talked to one of the English teachers at my school, and I don't know if they'd also heard of it, but we went on a class trip to a show that we probably shouldn't have gone to, this immersive show about prostitution and street hookers, both male and female, and it was probably more graphic than a group of high school students should have seen in the 80s. But that was my first time in the Berkeley Street Theater, and it sort of like bent my brain as something that made me sort of think like, oh, this, like, I thought theater was one thing, but this is like so different than anything I ever thought it was. And it's interesting to think about all of the different configurations that have been used in both that theater and in the Bluma Appel and the other theaters that have been used by Canadian Stage.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. Yeah. I mean, Canadian Stage is such a funny organization because it used to be two different companies. It used to be the Toronto Free Theater, which existed at the Berkeley, and then Center Stage, which operated out of the Bluma, and those two organizations merged to become Canadian Stage. And those organizations could not have been more different. Toronto Free Theater was, this kind of radical experimental theater company. It was called the Free Theater because, originally all their shows were free. They couldn't really maintain that. But that was sort of the idea, was like theater should be free for anybody. And was really, like the kind of show that you described was the kind of standard of the Toronto Free Theater. Center Stage was kind of a big regional that played kind of, Broadway, after Broadway, the shows would get picked up by Center Stage. So when those two companies merged together, like and I think that still is a part of the company's energy, is like, like this tension between kind of really experimental theater that makes you rethink what theater is, but then also kind of large scale, big idea theater, which requires, to attract like a big audience every night.
Yeah. Now you, as I believe you grew up in Montreal.
Yes.
And so I know Montreal, I've spent a little bit of time in Montreal, and I've always loved just walking around Montreal and being like, oh, that's essentially a neighborhood theater. Oh, that's essentially a neighborhood theater, and seeing that sort of thing. What was your experience of theater like growing up in Montreal?
Yeah, Montreal has a ton of theater, and for a portion of the population, it's a big part of their lives. I didn't grow up in a family where theater was at all a part of our lives. So I came into theater through kind of like a youth program. It's like it's like a sort of late '80s, early &90s. That was basically a kind of youth program to get kids off the streets, kind of thing. Basically there was like a kind of youth theater festival that happened in the old port of Montreal in this huge abandoned hangar. And young people kind of wrote and directed and acted in all the plays. I kind of remember a few adults kind of in the background making sure we didn't kill ourselves, but it was all about kind of youth empowerment. And so for some reason, my mother had a kind of instinct to suggest that, hey, Brendan, maybe you'd be interested in doing this thing. Because I certainly had no real experience of theater. I hadn't seen a play. But I said, sure, why not? Let's give this a shot. and that's sort of where I fell in love with theater. And it was only until after doing that for like maybe 2 or 3 summers that I learned that there was actually like people who did it for a living, that it was actually like a career. And then I got to kind of see my first professional production when I was 2 or 3 years after doing kind of this kind of theater. So yeah, but yes, all that to say is that Montreal does have a lot of theater. Yeah, I wasn't necessarily a part of it, and as growing up, and I think that's the thing about society is not everyone goes to see theater.
That's the thing. I mean, I've said it before, and we all know somebody who's like, you say, "Oh, I work in the theater," and they'll say something ridiculous like, "I saw a play once and I didn't like it," or things like that.
Yeah.
And so we know that people don't go to theater, or that they've had some bad theater experiences. But you started do you remember what that first production that you saw was?
Yeah, the first production I saw was so I grew up speaking French and going to French high school. So it was a Molière, les précieuses ridicules. I don't know what that is in English. But yeah, it was a big Molière play, kind of French, it was a bit punk rock. It was directed by a director named Lorraine Pintal, who still right now runs the Théâtre du Nouveau Monde, which is a very, large theater in Montreal. And she's sort of known for kind of sort of radical feminist kind of retelling of the classics. So I kind of remember there was a bit of a feminist edge to it. But to me, it was so not what I thought theater was, because I'd kind of been doing these kind of shows about growing up, what it was like to be a teenager. So it was just like I was like, what is this? This is theater? But I was also completely fascinated by it. And even though I didn't totally kind of get what was happening on stage, I was totally enthralled by the experience of it.
There's this I think it's interesting that you had that sort of experience of like, this is theater too, because I think for a lot of people, their first exposure to theater, unless they go to some pantos at Christmas, is probably when they tackle Shakespeare in high school. Right. And then they think that's what theater is. And then we sort of, if they see something else, and they could realize that, theater is more than just Shakespeare and Broadway musicals, which they may also know. But
yes,
it's interesting to see the different ways that people come to theater.
Totally. I mean, I think for me, kind of I fell in love with theater initially through this youth festival that I was talking about, because for me it was the first place where I really felt seen as a person. I think growing up, I felt just kind of like probably a lot of younger people, just really out of place. I felt invisible. I was also like a gay kid and kind of working class Montreal. Like I just was kind of getting beaten up, but suddenly at this theater, I felt that I mattered. I felt people saw me. I felt special. And there's also a place of where like a lot of firsts. It's where I kind of had my first cigarette. I ended up losing my virginity one summer at that festival. I met my first gay, real gay person. So it was a lot of kind of self-discovery. And so that's sort of my point of entry into the theater was that. But then it changed, and it kind of changed a little bit with that Molière play, and then subsequent shows was a kind of feeling of mystery, like what is this? What is this theater? What am I seeing? Who are these people on stage? And feeling like it was a bit beyond me. But the journey to try to understand was like a really exciting journey for me. I felt that way about Shakespeare. Kind of like, what the hell are these people talking about? Like, what is happening? But a good production, not a bad, a good production would make me want to kind of stretch myself to get it. And in that process of trying to get it, that's where I started to learn things. And that eventually became what I love about the theater, much less the kind of being seen and that sort of thing. It became much more about the conversation that good theater kind of demands of me, and yeah.
Yeah. Now you initially, like, you went into theater as an actor, but how long after that did you turn to directing?
I guess it wasn't that long. I mean, I started off as an actor and then went to university. I went to Concordia University in Montreal and their theater performance program and kind of did that. And, in university, teachers were like, Brendan, you should direct. You should really direct. And I always interpreted that as like, you kind of suck as an actor, So I was a bit resistant. I was like, I'm an actor. But I did take a directing class for kind of extra, for credit or whatever, and quite loved it. And then kind of graduated from school and tried to make it as a professional actor. I, got an agent, did a bit of television, and I was just like so miserable. The life of an actor just did not appeal to me at all. I ended up getting cast in this show that Peter Hinton was directing called Girls, Girls, Girls. And that was my first kind of experience with a director where I just was so amazed by what he was doing and his role in the process. And I thought, okay, I think I want to be like Peter Hinton. And so after that experience, I kind of made a decision that I'm going to try to be like Peter Hinton and just started to direct and kind of gave up acting.
Now, being in leadership in a theater and being an artistic director is a little bit different than being a director. Did you, at the time that you were making that decision, were you thinking about going into artistic direction, or were you just thinking about being a director?
Yeah, I wasn't thinking about artistic direction at all at that point. It was really just like, I want to direct. I want, among the things I loved about directing is that I could just kind of do it. Like I didn't have to wait for someone to invite me. So that really excited me. So I just started making like a ton of shows. I would just like kind of do a lot of shows and was only focused on that. It wasn't until later that artistic direction kind of emerged as an interest.
Now, did you have did that sort of, like, what was the journey to becoming an artistic director? Was there a mentor? Did somebody say you should do this? Like, how did you get from being a director to artistic director?
I guess in a way it was a bit of a fluke. I applied for a job and I got the job, and I got the job probably because I was like kind of just the right person at the right time. I kind of applied to the job, like kind of not sure that I wanted to be an artistic director, but kind of like I might want to be an artistic director. So I'm going to apply for this job, and I'm just going to kind of be sort of radically honest in my process with the interviews and just tell them exactly what I think I would do with the theater. And then I got the job, and then through the process of doing it, I really discovered how much I loved it. But I didn't necessarily know when I applied for the job that like this is what I totally wanted. I wasn't sure.
But it turned out to be what you wanted?
It absolutely no. It was it's exactly what I wanted, and I think what I learned through that process was. That really my great passion is community building, and that the theater is for me the best tool that I have as who I am to use to create community. But I think I going into the job, I thought theater was my great passion, and that artistic direction could kind of like help me kind of do more theater. And then I quickly realized like, oh no, actually, what this job provides me is the opportunity to create community, and that's what I really love. So yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about how you see it as creating community? I'd love to hear about the kind of community that you see being created, especially around Canadian stage.
Well, I think there's many communities. I think kind of at its most basic, like every night, a group of people come to see a show, and a kind of community is created that night around a story, around an experience. So there's that. I think there's the community of artists who make up the heart and soul of a theater company, and certainly Canadian Stage has a group of artists who kind of make up that community. There's the communities of people who live close by. So we're in the St. Lawrence neighborhood at Canadian Stage, and we are very actively involved in working with local community groups to kind of be a part of this neighborhood and to be an active contributor to the lives of the people who live nearby. So there's like all kinds of communities that sit around a theater, and that's really exciting, and it changes. My first artistic direction role was at Buddies in Bad Times, and certainly that's very much rooted in the LGBTQ2S communities, and so that was like a whole world of communities that I got to be a part of. So I mean, for me, theater is at its core is communing, and when you commune, community happens.
Yeah. I'm curious about the cultivation of the leadership of the future as far as theater in Canada goes. I wonder. I've noticed that organizations like Soul Pepper have created like sort of like what feel like internships for the future leadership to become an associate artistic director and to learn the ropes that way for people. And I think that's important because for a lot of years, some theaters have imported their artistic leadership from outside of the country, whereas we have plenty of people here who just need to know how to do it. As far as the cultivation of the leaders of the future, is there, or do you foresee a program at Canadian Stage that will help to do that?
Yeah, we have a lot of programs that do a lot. We do have programs that do that. We there is an associate artistic director role at the company, and that is in part to train the leaders of theaters of tomorrow. That's the big reason why we have that role. That role also brings in all kinds of important expertise to the organization. We do all kinds of internships through the Metcalf Foundation. We have our own internship programs where we really feel it's critical that we're constantly training leaders of, administrative leaders, artistic leaders, production leaders. It's a big part of what we do.
It's so important. It's so important because if we're not teaching people on the job, that's the only way. I mean, you could take a course, but like really getting your hands in there is the only thing that's going to get you that work later on. And it's so important that we build that foundation in Canada rather than hoping we can find it elsewhere. So I think that's amazing that's an essential part of what Canadian Stage is doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree.
Do you have a favorite thing, whether it's a production or aspect of Canadian Stage that is just like the thing that you just, when you think about it, gives you all the warm fuzzies, and it's the thing that makes you smile?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's a ton of stuff. I think for me, the thing that excites me the most is the sheer variety of stuff that the company does, and we do dance, we do theater, we have like small spaces, we have large spaces, we do a big outdoor Shakespeare. I mean, we really cover such a gamut of work and styles, and so for me, it's the way that those things connect that I find them to be the most interesting. Like the relationship between our spaces, between the art forms, between the audiences that we have every year. It's really, really exciting. And that's often what excites me is when things kind of come together or kind of collide. Some of my favorite experiences at Buddies, for instance, I remember this one instance where, we had a company, Nightwood was doing the Penelopiad by Margaret Atwood. And like that show was ending. And then our club night, we run a club at Buddy's, and a bunch of drag queens kind of like coming up a staircase to kind of perform, while this audience of Margaret Atwood playgoers kind of was exiting the theater, and watching those two groups meet was really, really exciting for me. So yeah, I think at Canadian Stage, it's the collision of things that I find so dynamic and exciting.
I remember years ago the production. I think it was a co-pro between Canadian Stage and another theater of the Rocky Horror Show. And I remember that collision. I remember being in the audience, watching, and really being fascinated by the way that the subscriber base and the people who are maybe regular theater goers coming face to face and in many ways ear to ear with like the people for whom that show, the Rocky Horror Show, is an interactive experience. And that was fascinating to watch an adjustment take place in an audience. And those, you're right, those kinds of collisions and intertanglements are quite fascinating to watch.
Absolutely. I mean, I another way of thinking about a theater, as apart from being communities, is like an ecology, and it's like an ecosystem, and there's all kinds of players that kind of come together to make that ecosystem, and that sort of the most like vital ecosystems are actually areas where ecosystems meet, like the seashore, for instance, where you have like land and water meet. That's like a really like fertile space. And so if you're in a theater, if you're able to kind of create these conditions where ecosystems meet, it gets really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. As far as, I mean, you mentioned like, really your experience of being the artistic director at Canadian Stage has largely been dealing with the pandemic. We are like around the time when this goes out, we will be just past the 2-year anniversary of the time when everything shut down. What were you working on at the time that everything had to shut down in March of 2020?
Yeah, I mean, we had just, what was I working on? We had just closed a show that I had directed called How to Fail as a Pop Star by Vivek Shreya, and we were just sort of getting ready for a big dance show at the Baluma, and we had just sort of announced the kind of 1920 season, and like subscription sales were like going like gangbusters. Like it was I was like, okay, I'd been at the company for about eight or 9 months at that point. And I was like, okay, I sort of felt like I was kind of, my feet were sort of landing. And I was kind of like, okay, I get what's going on. And then and everything changed. And in fact, I was in Brazil when the actual shutdown happened. I just landed in Brazil. Like I'd been invited to go see a theater festival there. It's like my first time in Brazil. I got off the plane, and then like literally 6 hours later, there was the announcing that everything was shutting down, and I got on a plane the next day and came home.
Wow. I remember for me, knowing that, I think the moment where it became real for me was the news that Broadway was shutting down.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, this commercial machine is shutting down. And then we just saw things go from there. I think those weeks after that were some of the most depressing and dire at first for me. But then also when I started to see innovation happening and creativity continuing, even though for me it took me about a year before I could put pen to paper and write something again. Just seeing that people were able to do it was heartening for me, and I thought it was. I knew that theater was going to survive in some way.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're inherently creative beings, and creativity never goes away. yeah, it was wild. I mean, it still kind of feels actually like a bit like a dream. It was just so surreal.
Yeah. Everything is, I mean, I remember, just today, I just put out an episode talking with Lisa Alves from, as we record this today, Lisa Alves from Cahoots Theater. And it was pointed out that after we produced it, that she'd referred to 2019 for a bunch of things that actually happened in 2020 and 2021. And I was like, well, of course, because we're all still like, what is time?
Right. Yeah.
Because time has it like, I feel like the last 2 years have been both so breathlessly fast and also snail's pace slow at the same time. So it's easy to sort of like see the last 2 years as a dream state.
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing that time can do that. And just how totally subjective time is.
As I'm trying to think, because there's, as we're recording this today, we're recording this on March 1st. Today, Ontario has lifted vaccination passes and gathering limits and things like that, although masking is still required. And I know there's a lot of talk about both ways about how people want to do it. Some theaters have announced that they're going to continue to look at vaccination passes, and some theaters haven't announced anything like that. Do you know what Canadian Stage is planning to do for the foreseeable future on that front?
Yeah, we have a show coming up in a couple of weeks in my body, and so for that one we'll keep checking vaccinations. Part of it, that's people who've bought their tickets for that show, bought their ticket with the understanding that was going to be part of the experience. So, we want to honor that. And then we'll kind of just sort of evaluate. I think if there's one thing that the pandemic has taught us is kind of how to be nimble and just sort of monitor and see how people are feeling, how safe people are feeling. For us, what's really important is that people feel safe and comfortable. And so we'll start with that. In a couple of weeks, and then we'll kind of reevaluate and kind of check in with our audience. It's been great. We've done a lot of checking in with our audience throughout the pandemic, and our audience has been like incredibly forthcoming with how they feel and what they want. So we'll just kind of keep monitoring the situation, as they say.
Yeah, having that kind of feedback is so important and helpful. Do you feel like the kind of connection and feedback that you're getting from the audience has gotten, like that feedback has gotten better and more regular through the pandemic, or is it something that has always existed for Canadian Stage?
I mean, it's different, because obviously when you're doing shows every night, you just get the feedback nightly. But it's really directed to a show. With the pandemic, what the feedback has been more around the experience of theater, what safety and comfort, and also just kind of more institutional, like what is our value to you? So it's been interesting. It's like I feel the feedback has been continuous, but just like very different in nature.
Yeah. Well, I guess, in a lot of ways, people aren't seeing their experience in just a show-to-show aspect. They're looking at things like you said, comfort and safety and things like that. So I'm sure lots of people have lots of feelings about that.
Yeah. And I think a lot of businesses are kind of like, okay, like what is a customer experience now? It wasn't what it was 2 years ago. And I think we're going to kind of collectively learn what that is. I think audiences don't necessarily even know yet what it is that they need and want. I think we're all going to kind of figure it out together.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's one of those things where we are like we've sort of like alluded to, we're figuring out theater as we go now, because We have to figure out what we're taking from this moving forward, and what's going to continue, what's going to change, and with the knowledge that we still have to be nimble and might have to switch on a dime.
Absolutely. And it, for me, what that requires is just kind of like listening and paying attention. You can't predict, like goes back to sort of what we were saying at the beginning of the conversation. Like we could sit here and try to predict, but it's literally impossible. The skill, in my opinion, is to just really pay attention, which is like the fundamental thing that one must do in the theater anyways, is just pay attention, be present, listen, and react, respond.
Yeah. And I think it's sort of forced a lot of institutions that may not have been used to moving so quickly to be able to, and to have to move quickly when they have to.
Yeah.
Because there's no choice. It sort of like makes you change the way that you think about how do we measure success here? Because from week to week, the way that we measure success might have to change.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Just as we sort of draw to a close, can you talk about, you're back in the theater. We've talked a little bit about what it's been like to rehearse. As you look at the show that you're currently rehearsing, if you could put out into the universe what you want for this show, what would that be? I think it's probably what I want for any show is for it to be seen, and for it to move people. Really, I feel like I don't know if I have anything else to kind of add to that. I think for me, the most satisfying, if you will, experience is affecting another person through art. Like I find that to be really, really meaningful, and my favorite experiences in the theater have always been moments where I'm like watching a show and I think to myself, wow, like how did this person know this about me? I didn't even really know that about me. I can think of instances where I've really felt like, wow, that show is showing me something about myself that I didn't really even know existed. And I think I always want to make theater that does that for other people. That somehow through the magic of make-believe, pretend, story, or like all the things that we work with as theater artists, that we're able to kind of like reveal some truth to somebody. Yeah, I think that is the power of theater is to be able to do that, and it's magical when that happens. Well, Brendan, thank you so much for talking with me today. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you. My pleasure.